The candles on that dining table had been burning for 2 hours before Lamont Gadsden decided to use them as his audience lighting. Everything was going the way family dinners in Atlanta go. Loud, warm, plates passed without asking, laughter arriving before the punchline. I was seated at the far end of the table, the end closest to the kitchen. The end I always chose because from there I could see everyone and no one had to look directly at me to include me. That should have told me something years ago. It didn't. Lamont stood up slowly, the kind of slow that wants to be noticed. He picked up his glass and tapped it once, not for a toast, I would learn, but for an audience. The table quieted. Uncle Drayden leaned back in his chair, the way men do when they already know what's coming and have decided they approve. Then, Lamont smiled at me across the length of that table and said, "I want to be honest with everybody tonight. I only married Davina out of pity." He paused, letting it settle. "I mean, who else was going to love an ugly fat pig?" The laughter started before the sentence finished. Uncle Drayden went first, a full, open sound that shook his shoulders. Others followed. Not all of them, but enough. Enough to fill the room. Enough to make the ones who didn't laugh look at their plates instead of at me. I did not move. I want you to understand what I mean when I say that. I did not reach for my glass. I did not push back my chair. I did not look at Lamont with the expression he was waiting for. The one that would confirm for everyone at that table that what he said had found its target. I sat with my hands folded in my lap and I let the laughter run its full length. Because I had learned something in 11 years of marriage to that man. A wound only has power when you show it. My name is Davina Presswood. And the night my husband tried to humiliate me in front of his entire family was the night I stopped letting him borrow my silence. Before I tell you what happened next, and I need you to stay with me because what happened next changed everything. Drop in the comments and tell me what time you are watching this. I want to know who is up with me tonight. The laughter was still settling when the chair at Lamont's left side scraped back from the table. Kobe stood up. He was 23 years old and he had his father's height and absolutely none of his father's performance. He didn't raise his voice. He looked directly at Lamont with the patience of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment and had decided in advance how he would handle it. He smiled once. Then he said, "Dad, Davina's name is on the contract that built everything you're standing up there bragging about. Maybe you should sit down." The room went so quiet I could hear the candle nearest to me crackling in its holder. Lamont's hands, both of them, wrapped around that glass he had tapped for attention, began to shake. I looked at my stepson for exactly 3 seconds. Then I looked back at my plate. Because I had just made a decision that not one person at that table was equipped to understand yet. And I needed them all to stay comfortable just a little while longer. The house was too quiet to be peaceful. I moved through it the way you move through a place you are already beginning to leave. Not with urgency, not with grief, but with the particular attention of someone taking inventory. The kitchen counter I had chosen because the light hit it correctly in the morning. The shelving unit in the hallway I had assembled alone on a Sunday because Lamont said he would help, and then didn't come home until evening. The framed print above the fireplace I had bought with my own money 2 months before I ever met him. I touched none of it. I just looked. There is a version of tonight where I go upstairs and cry into something that still smells like the life I thought I was building. I am not that version of myself. I tried her on once, years ago, and she didn't fit. I met Lamont Gadsden at a business mixer in Buckhead on a Thursday evening in October. He was the best-dressed man in a room full of well-dressed men. which I later understood was the only investment he was making consistently at the time. He introduced himself with the confidence of someone who had already arrived. It took me 4 conversations across 6 weeks to understand that the confidence was the only thing he owned outright. He had Kobe, 19 then, quiet. In the way young men are quiet when they have seen too much and decided that watching is safer than speaking. They were living in a 2-bedroom apartment in Decatur that Lamont described as transitional. I saw it once. Transitional was generous. I was 38 years old. I had spent 14 years building a career in commercial property consulting. And until Lamont, I had never once made a serious financial decision because I was emotionally attached to the future it represented. That was the part I misunderstood later when I tried to explain it to myself too logically. People like to imagine intelligent women get manipulated because they fail to see reality. That wasn't what happened. I saw reality perfectly clearly. I saw a man with ambition, uneven discipline, a son who needed stability, and a life that looked like it could become something solid with the right structure around it. And if I am being truthful, I was tired. Not lonely in the dramatic sense, not desperate, just tired of building entire rooms of my life alone and pretending independence always felt noble instead of exhausting. The business was my idea first. Not in the way people say things are their idea, vaguely, romantically, without documentation. I mean, I sat at my dining room table with a legal pad and worked out the model before I presented it to him. I had a contact at a supply firm in Marietta who owed me a professional favor. I called that favor in for Lamont. The first contract the business ever signed existed because my name was on the communication that initiated it. The startup capital, $42,000, came from a savings account Lamont never had access to and never asked about directly, because asking directly would have required him to acknowledge what he was receiving. In the beginning, my name was on more of the paperwork than it later appeared to be. Not because I was careless, because at the time there was no reason not to trust the structure we were building. Then, the business started growing fast. Clients multiplied, vendor accounts expanded. We hired staff, deadlines stacked on top of each other. Lamont gradually took over filings, renewals, and state paperwork, while I handled operations and contracts. Small adjustments happened one at a time. A form updated here, a filing simplified there, things explained with phrases like cleaning up the records or making everything consistent for taxes. Nothing disappeared all at once. That's why I did not see the full shape of it immediately. I let him put his name on the front because I believed that a man who felt like he was building something would eventually become the man I could see he had the capacity to be. That was the most expensive mistake of my professional life. I walked to the second bedroom, the one I had converted into a home office 3 years into the marriage, and opened the bottom drawer of my desk. The folder was where it had always been, cream-colored, unremarkable, held shut with a single black clip. Inside it were documents I had kept without fully admitting to myself why I was keeping them. Contracts, transfer records, a copy of the original business registration with a detail buried in the filing that Lamont had quietly handled himself years later under the explanation of administrative cleanup. At the time, I had accepted it because I was managing operations, clients, invoices, deadlines, the actual movement of the company, and because trusting your husband with paperwork does not feel reckless while you're still calling yourselves a team. I set the folder on the desk without opening it. Then I turned off the light and went to bed. Not because I was finished, because I had just decided where to begin. He knocked twice before I reached the door. I had been up since 5, sitting at the kitchen table with coffee I hadn't touched, and when I heard the knock, I already knew it was him. Kobe has knocked on doors the same way since he was 19. 2 precise sounds, nothing excessive. The knock of someone who respects the space they are entering. I opened the door and he came in without a long greeting. He sat down across from me at the kitchen table, folded his hands the way he does when he has something structured to say, and looked at me directly. "I need to tell you some things," he said. "And I need you to just let me get through them." I nodded once. He began. He told me about the apartment in Decatur first, not the one I had seen, but the one before it. A one-bedroom in a complex off Candler Road where he slept on a pull-out sofa for 7 months while his father took the bedroom. He was 18. He said this without bitterness, the way you describe weather. It happened. It was the condition of things. He told me about the period between that apartment and the next. 3 weeks where they stayed with a woman whose name he never learned properly because his father introduced her differently each time. He ate what she cooked and said thank you and asked no questions, because asking questions then cost more than it returned. He told me about the evening he came home to find an eviction notice folded under the doormat. His father hadn't mentioned the rent situation. He had, however, bought a new watch that same month. Kobe said all of this evenly. No performance, no pause, for effect. Then he said, "You came in and the temperature changed. That's the only way I know how to say it. Nothing was announced. You didn't make a speech about what you were doing or why. Things just started being different, consistent. The refrigerator stayed full. The lights stayed on. I stopped doing the math every morning about what was about to go wrong. I kept my hands around my coffee cup." He wasn't finished. "I was 19, he said. Not a child. And when you've spent years watching adults try to hold unstable things together, you start remembering details whether you want to or not." The kitchen was very still. "I saw whose money opened that business," he continued. "I was sitting in the next room when you made that first call to the man in Marietta. I didn't remember every word. I remembered your name because my father repeated it afterward. He kept saying, 'Raymond only took the meeting because she already knew him.' That landed differently. Not perfect memory. Repeated memory." Kobe reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out his phone first. He opened an old backup folder and slid it across the table toward me. Screenshots, old timestamps, notes he had apparently emailed himself years ago because, as he later explained it, he was used to documenting things whenever housing or money became unstable. Then he set a folded piece of paper beside the phone. It was a photograph, printed, not digital, of a whiteboard covered in my handwriting. Business projections, contact names, a budget breakdown, my work, dated 14 months before the business officially opened. Kobe gave a small shrug when he saw me looking at it. "You used to leave that board up for weeks at a time," he said. "I took the picture because I was trying to remember what stable people sounded like when they planned things. I looked at the photograph for a long time. Then I looked at him." "You're not going anywhere," I said. It was not a question. "I haven't gone anywhere," he said. "You just weren't ready to notice." The folder was still on the desk where I had left it the night before. I sat down in front of it the way you sit down in front of something you have been circling for a long time. Not rushing, not afraid, just finally ready to look at it directly. I unclipped it. Laid the contents out across the desk in the order they happened. Not the order Lamont would tell it. The order it actually happened. The first document was a personal bank statement from April 11 years ago. A withdrawal of $42,000. No memo line. I remembered the exact morning I made it, a Tuesday, raining. The kind of Atlanta rain that makes the city smell like wet concrete and possibility. I had sat in my car outside the bank for 6 minutes before going in. Not because I was uncertain, because I understood the weight of what I was about to do and I wanted to feel it fully before I did it. Lamont never asked where the money came from in a way that required a real answer. He said, "You're serious about this?" And I said I was, and that was the entire conversation. The second document was a printed email chain between myself and Raymond Osei at Consolidated Supply in Marietta. Raymond had worked with me on 3 commercial property projects over 7 years. When I called him about the new business, he said yes because of my name and my record, and more than a decade of professional credibility standing behind the ask. Lamont attended the first meeting. He shook Raymond's hand and spoke well, and Raymond was gracious. But the relationship existed before Lamont walked into the room, and it existed because of me. I had printed that email chain the same week, filed it without explaining why, even to myself. The third set of documents was the original business registration paperwork. Lamont's name ran across the top as principal. But deeper in the filing, in the section recording initial capital contribution, my name appeared. Davina A. Presswood, contributor. The amendment filed months later had reclassified my contribution as a spousal gift, a change I had not formally approved in writing and did not fully understand the implications of at the time. Back then, the company was expanding quickly. We were onboarding clients faster than we anticipated, managing vendor delays, hiring part-time administrative help, and trying to keep contracts moving without losing momentum. Lamont gradually became the person handling outside filings, annual renewals, accountant communication, and state paperwork because he was already presenting himself publicly as the face of the company. At the time, the amendment had been explained to me casually. Administrative cleanup, simplifying paperwork for tax consistency. I remembered standing in the kitchen while Lamont mentioned it in passing, with a stack of documents under his arm and a phone pressed to his ear. He said the accountant wanted the filings standardized because some documents listed my contribution differently than others. I had accepted the explanation because I was buried in the operational side of the business and because marriages do not usually collapse all at once. They shift gradually into imbalance while both people continue calling it partnership. But something about that conversation unsettled me enough that 2 years into the marriage, I pulled the filing myself through the state records portal. And when I saw the reclassification in writing, I made a copy that same day. I set that page aside separately now. Lamont was the face of the business because I chose it that way. I believed then that a man who felt like he was leading something would grow into the leader the business needed. I handled the architecture. He handled the presentation. For 4 years, that arrangement produced results, and I told myself the arrangement was working. What I understand now, sitting at this desk with 11 years of documentation spread in front of me, is that I confused results with partnership. The business was growing. That part was true. But the growth was happening inside a structure I built and maintained, while pieces of my ownership were being softened, reworded, and quietly repositioned into the background, one filing adjustment at a time. Every document on that desk had my fingerprints on it before it had his signature. I stacked them carefully, clipped the folder shut. The originals, the admissible copies, were still inside the business files. I would need those eventually. But I wasn't walking into any attorney's office until I understood exactly what story the documents could prove and exactly where the weak points still were. Now I knew. The first time I noticed something was wrong, Lamont was laughing at his phone. Not the casual laugh of a man watching something amusing. The private kind. The kind that arrives before the expression can be managed. Quick, unguarded, immediately suppressed when he registered that I was in the room. He turned the screen down and said something about a work group chat. I nodded and went back to what I was doing. I filed it. Said nothing. That was 14 months ago. What followed was not dramatic. It rarely is at first. It was a series of small adjustments in the atmosphere of a man who believes he is being careful. The phone charging face down on his nightstand, instead of on the dresser where it had sat for 9 years. The schedule shifts that arrived with explanations that were just detailed enough to feel rehearsed. The way he stopped looking at me when he entered a room, not with hostility, with something more specific than that. With the particular non-focus of someone who has moved their attention somewhere else entirely and is now managing the distance. I noticed all of it. I watched all of it. I said nothing. Because suspicion without proof is just pain, with no architecture. And I had spent enough years in commercial property to understand that you do not move on a site until the survey is complete. 3 weeks after the dinner, I found what I had been measuring toward. Lamont had left his laptop open on the kitchen counter, something he had stopped doing months ago and had apparently forgotten to resume being careful about. I was not looking for anything. I was passing through. The screen was active, and what was on it was not a work document. It was a reservation confirmation. A restaurant on the west side of Atlanta I had never been to with Lamont. Table for 2. His name. The date was 4 days before the family dinner. The email thread beneath the confirmation continued, and in it was a name. Tressa. Not a last name in the thread. Just Tressa. And below his confirmation reply to her, a photograph she had sent him, time-stamped, unambiguous, the kind of image a woman sends a man she's not concerned about being discovered by because she believes the wife has already been managed. I stood at that counter for 40 seconds. I took out my phone and photographed the screen, the reservation, the thread, the image, the timestamp. All of it documented in the same 60-second window before I set my phone face down on the counter next to his laptop and continued to the refrigerator for what I had originally come to retrieve. That was the moment I expected to feel something rupture. It didn't rupture. It clarified. The grief I had been anticipating, the devastating, destabilizing kind, had apparently already processed itself during 14 months of watching and filing and saying nothing. What arrived instead in that kitchen was something colder and more useful than grief. A complete and total absence of surprise. And underneath that absence, something that felt almost like relief. Not because the marriage was over. I had known the marriage was over before the dinner, because now Tressa had a timestamp. And Lamont had a habit of leaving things open that he should have kept closed. And I understood something about Tressa in that moment that she did not yet understand about herself. She wasn't inheriting a successful man. She was inheriting a debt that hadn't been called in yet. Cecily Drummond's office was on the 14th floor of a building on Peachtree Street, where the elevator opened directly into a waiting area that smelled like leather and cold air. I had made the appointment 4 days after the dinner. I had not told anyone. Not Inez. Not Kobe. I had simply looked up Cecily's name, given to me 2 years ago by a woman at a professional event who said, "If you ever need someone who doesn't flinch, call her." And I had called her. I was shown in at exactly 10 o'clock. Cecily Drummond was smaller than I expected. Precise in the way people are precise when they have spent decades making sure nothing they do can be misread. She stood when I entered, shook my hand once, and gestured to the chair across from her desk without unnecessary warmth or unnecessary distance. I sat. I placed the folder on the desk between us. She looked at it, then at me. "Do you want to tell me what's in it, or should I just read it?" "Read it," I said. She did. 12 minutes without speaking. She turned pages the way surgeons handle things, with full attention and no wasted movement. Twice, she went back to a page she had already read and looked at it again. Once, she made a note on the legal pad beside her without looking up. When she finished, she set the folder down and looked at me directly. "You're not here about a divorce," she said. "I'm here About what belongs to me. She nodded slowly. This capital contribution on the original registration, the amendment that later reclassified it as a spousal gift. Were you present when that amendment was filed? I was not. Were you asked to authorize it in writing? No. Did you sign anything that could reasonably be interpreted as consent to that reclassification? Nothing. She made another note. Then she set her pen down and folded her hands on top of the folder. What you have here, she said carefully, appears to be a founding contribution that may have been recharacterized without proper documentation or informed consent. If the originals support what these copies suggest, that matters. The room was quiet. She continued. The supplier relationship tied to your professional network matters. The withdrawal trail matters. The guarantee document matters. None of this automatically wins anything by itself, Ms. Presswood. But together, it creates a record of participation that is difficult to dismiss as ordinary spousal support. That was the first moment I trusted her completely. Not because she promised victory, because she didn't. The originals, she said. The admissible copies, they're still in the business files? Yes. We'll need those through formal discovery. And discovery moves slower than people think. Opposing counsel will challenge valuation, intent, contribution percentages, all of it. I want you prepared for that now instead of surprised by it later. I understand. What you've brought me today tells me where to look and what questions to ask, she said. Then she paused. Mrs. Gadsden. Presswood, I said. My name is Presswood. Something shifted in her expression, not surprise, recognition. Ms. Presswood, she corrected smoothly. Based on what is sitting on this desk, I do not think you are simply a spouse seeking equitable division. I think there is a credible argument that you were materially involved in the formation and stabilization of this business. The words landed differently because she said them without drama. But arguments still require proof, she continued, and proof requires patience. So before we discuss outcomes, we build the record properly. I had known that before I walked through her door. Still, there is a particular weight that arrives when someone with the credentials to see what you built looks directly at the evidence and acknowledges it plainly. I picked up my bag. Then let's build it properly, I said. Lamont came home that Thursday evening with dry cleaning and a story. I heard him before I saw him. The particular volume of a man who has decided that filling a room with sound is the same as owning it. He was on the phone with someone, laughing, recounting something that had apparently happened at lunch. I caught fragments from the kitchen. His name mentioned 3 times in his own anecdote. The words, my company, used twice in 40 seconds. I was sorting mail at the counter when he came through. He glanced at me the way you glance at furniture you have stopped seeing, registering presence without interest. He finished his call, set his keys down, and moved to the refrigerator without a word in my direction. This was the version of Lamont I had been watching for 3 weeks. Unguarded, expansive. The posture of a man who had assessed the situation after the dinner and concluded that the situation was manageable. Kobe's words at that table had apparently been filed under temporary embarrassment and closed. Whatever he believed I was doing in my silence, it was not what I was actually doing. He left for an event that Saturday evening without mentioning it beforehand. He dressed carefully, a new jacket I had not seen before. When I asked where he was going, he said a networking function and was out of the door before the sentence had fully landed. I stood at the front window and watched his car leave the driveway. Later that evening, Uncle Drayden posted a photograph on social media. A restaurant downtown. Lamont at the center of a table of people I recognized as family and people I recognized as something closer to an audience. He was mid-laugh, comfortable. The photograph had 17 comments inside the first hour. Uncle Drayden's was first, a string of praise that would have been more appropriate at an awards ceremony than a dinner. Tressa was not in the photograph, but she had liked it within 4 minutes of it being posted. I noted the timestamp and kept moving. The mail that day had been heavier than usual. 2 business envelopes mixed in with the household correspondence. A habit Lamont had developed of routing certain business mail to the house rather than the office, something he had never adequately explained, and I had never pressed. I was setting them aside for him when the return address on the second envelope stopped me. Consolidated Supply, Marietta, Georgia. Raymond Osei's firm. The relationship I had built over 7 years before Lamont ever shook Raymond's hand. The account that existed because I had made a phone call with my name and my record behind it. I opened the envelope. It was a standard account correspondence. Updated contact information on file. Primary account holder listed as Lamont Gadsden. Relationship manager listed under his direct contact information. Current referral. Source. Internal continuation account. But when I reached the archived account summary attached at the back, the older transfer history they occasionally included during annual updates, I saw something that made me stop. The original referral notation had been modified, not erased completely, shifted. My name appeared once in smaller text under legacy account notes, while the active relationship history credited Lamont as the originating business contact. Someone had simplified the account history over time into the cleaner version now attached to the company profile. A person unfamiliar with the original filings would read the document and assume the relationship had always belonged primarily to him. I took out my phone and photographed every page. Then I folded the envelope closed, set it with his other mail, and finished sorting the rest of the correspondence. Lamont walked back through the door at 11:43. He was still telling himself a story about who built what. I had just found another chapter of the real one. Cecily called on a Wednesday morning at 8:47. I was at my desk when the phone rang. I had been expecting the call for 6 days. Not impatiently, the way you wait for something you are afraid of, but with the particular steadiness of someone who has already accepted every possible outcome and is simply waiting for confirmation of which one arrived. "I need you to come in," Cecily said. "Today, if you can manage it." Her voice was level, but there was something underneath the level that I recognized from 11 years of reading rooms and the people inside them. She had found something that changed the weight of things. I was in her office by 11. She had the documents arranged on her desk in a sequence that told a story before she said a word. Wire transfer records from my personal account. The $42,000 withdrawal and 3 subsequent transfers in the business's first operating year, totaling an additional $19,000. A supplier guarantee document bearing my professional license number, signed 18 months into the business when a contract required a credentialed guarantor, and Lamont's credentials were insufficient. The consolidated supply account origination records Cecily had formally obtained from Raymond Osei's firm after preservation requests had been issued. My name on the original. The amendment filed later, exactly as the envelope at the house had shown. Lamont's attorney had submitted an initial position paper framing me as a supportive spouse whose financial involvement reflected ordinary marital contribution with no formal business role. Cecily had laid his argument beside her findings the way you lay a forecast beside a photograph of what the weather actually did. His position weakened significantly at the guarantee document, she said. A supportive spouse does not sign a supplier guarantee under her professional license. That is a formal business act, carrying legal liability. It places you inside the operational structure of the company, regardless of how the later filings tried to characterize your role. I nodded, but that is not why I asked you to come in today. She moved the position paper aside and placed a single document in front of me. The original business registration. I recognized it immediately. My name was there on the founding document. Davina A. Presswood, co-registrant. Then she placed a second document beside it, an amended filing submitted 3 years later. My name was gone. In the co-registrant field, the word none had been typed cleanly. And at the bottom of the amendment, in the signature line designated for all named parties on the original filing, was a signature. My name, written by someone who was not me. I looked at it for a long time. "That is not my signature," I said. "I don't believe it is," Cecily said carefully. "I had a forensic document examiner conduct a preliminary review this morning using authenticated samples from your prior filings and banking documents. The opinion is not final yet, but the examiner found substantial inconsistencies in stroke pressure, letter formation, and signature rhythm." The room was very still. "What happens now?" I asked. "We continue through civil discovery first," she said. "That remains the priority. We secure the originals, establish the contribution trail, and lock the record down properly." She paused. "Separately, if the final examiner report supports the preliminary findings, this amendment may be referred for regulatory review, potentially criminal review as well. But I want to be very clear about something." She folded her hands. "This does not automatically mean your husband sat at a desk and intentionally forged your signature himself. Businesses sometimes use outside filing services, accountants, administrative processors. People sign things casually, sometimes improperly. Right now, we focus on what can actually be proven, not what feels emotionally satisfying." Something about the way she said it made me trust her more. "You're saying this is serious," I said. "I'm saying that if your name was improperly removed from a founding business filing using a disputed signature, the exposure is larger than divorce court." Cecily leaned back slightly. "But I want you focused on documentation, not revenge. Courts respond better to evidence than emotion." I looked back down at my name written in someone else's hand, and I understood that what had begun as correction had just become something Lamont had no preparation for. He found out on a Friday. I knew the exact moment it reached him because his car was in the driveway when I came home that evening, 2 hours earlier than his schedule had run for the past 3 weeks. He was sitting in the kitchen with his phone face up on the table and the particular stillness of a man who has just received information that rearranged something fundamental and has not yet decided how to respond to it. He looked at me when I came through the door. I set my bag down and went to the kitchen counter without acknowledging the atmosphere he was generating. I heard him exhale slowly behind me. Then I heard him pick up his phone. He made 3 calls in the next hour from the back bedroom with the door closed. The walls in that house were not as substantial as he believed. The first 2 calls I could not identify by voice. The third I recognized immediately. Uncle Drayden's particular greeting, the base of it, coming through clearly enough that I could track the shape of the conversation even without the words. Lamont's tone on that call was careful and controlled, in the way that men are careful and controlled when they are asking for something they cannot afford to name directly. The call lasted 11 minutes. When it ended, he came back to the kitchen and poured himself a drink without offering me one, which had stopped being an oversight approximately 8 months into the marriage. He called me at 9:17 that same evening. I was in the second bedroom when the phone rang. I looked at his name on the screen for 4 seconds before I answered. "You need to stop this." His voice was measured, the tone he used in professional settings when he wanted to project reasonableness while occupying all the space in the room. "You're making a mistake that you are not going to be able to walk back." I said nothing. He continued. The business was his vision, his labor, his decade of work. Whatever role I believed I had played had been generously compensated through the life the business provided. the house, the comfort, the stability. He said the word stability with a particular weight, as though reminding me that I had once needed it. He told me his attorney had reviewed the filing history and found my position entirely without merit. He told me Atlanta was a smaller city than people understood and that what I was doing would cost me professionally in ways I had not calculated. Then he said, "You were never a businesswoman, Davina. You were a wife who wanted to feel like one." The line was silent for a moment. Then I said, "I've noted the call, Lamont. My attorney will be in touch with yours." Nothing else. He waited for more, for the argument, for the emotion, for something he could work with. There was nothing to work with. I ended the call and set the phone face down on the desk beside the folder that contained, among other things, a disputed signature on a legal document tied to his authorization. He had called to make me feel small enough to stop. What he had actually done was confirm for me that he understood the exposure and had chosen threat over accountability. Uncle Drayden was now holding a property deed he had accepted without understanding what accepting it meant legally. And Lamont had just made that phone call without knowing it was the last time he would have anything resembling the upper hand. I drove to Inez Calhoun's house on a Sunday afternoon without calling ahead. She opened the door before I reached the porch, the way she always did, as though she had been expecting me regardless of whether I had announced myself. She looked at my face for exactly 1 second, then stepped aside and let me in without a word. That was the thing about Inez. She never made you explain the shape you arrived in. Her house smelled like something cooking low and slow on the stove. She went back to the kitchen and I followed and sat at her table, a round table near the window with 3 mismatched chairs that she had owned since before I knew her. I had sat at this table through 2 job changes, a family loss, and the specific loneliness of a marriage that was working on paper and nowhere else. She set a bowl in front of me without asking if I was hungry. I had not eaten a full meal in 4 days. I ate while she sat across from me and waited. Inez had a quality I had never been able to adequately describe to anyone who hadn't experienced it. A patience that didn't feel like waiting. It felt like presence. Like she had set down every other thing and was simply and completely there. When I finished, she took the bowl and refilled it and set it back down. I said, "I didn't call you the night of the dinner." "I know," she said. "It wasn't because I didn't need you." "I know that too." I looked at the window for a moment. The afternoon light was doing something specific to the oak tree in her yard, illuminating just the upper branches while the trunk stayed in shadow. I watched it and tried to find the beginning of what I needed to say. "I loved him," I said. I want to say that out loud to someone who won't use it against me or file it away as weakness. I loved him, and I believed that what I was building with him was real and mutual, and I was wrong about the mutual part, and that is the part that costs the most. Inez said nothing. She did not nod sympathetically or reach for my hand or offer the kind of comfort that is really just a request for the conversation to move toward resolution. She simply received it. "I keep thinking about the version of myself that made that first phone call to Raymond," I said. "The one that drove to the bank in the rain. She was so certain. She wasn't naive. She was certain. And I don't know how to explain to her what happened to what she was certain about." "You don't have to explain it to her," Inez said. "She already became you." The kitchen was quiet except for the stove. I felt something release in my chest that had been held at a specific tension for so long I had stopped registering it as pressure. Not grief, exactly. Not relief. Something older than both. The particular exhaustion of a woman who has been carrying the full weight of a situation with perfect composure and has finally set it down in a room where setting it down is permitted. I did not cry. But I came close enough that Inez noticed and looked deliberately at her own hands to give me the privacy of almost. We sat there until the light changed in the oak tree. Then I picked up my bag. "I'm all right," I said. "I know," she said. "You've been all right. You just needed somewhere to put it for a minute." Kobe called me on a Tuesday morning to tell me what he was about to do. Not to ask permission. Not to check whether I was comfortable with it. He called because he wanted me to hear it from him directly before I heard it from anyone else. Which is the kind of consideration that cannot be taught and cannot be performed. Either a person has it or they don't. "I'm moving the last of my things out of his storage unit today," he said, "and I'm going to talk to Uncle Drayden before I do." I asked him if he was certain. "I've been certain," he said. "I was just waiting for the right time to stop being quiet about it." He drove to Uncle Drayden's house first. I learned the details of that conversation later, from Kobe himself, relayed with the same evenness he brought to everything. He sat across from Drayden and told him plainly that he had been a witness to things that were now legally relevant, not peripheral things. Specific things that stayed with him because of when they happened and what they revealed. He had been present in his father's home office 3 years into the business when Lamont took a call from a potential partner and described the founding of the company without mentioning my name once. Not as an oversight, but as a practiced omission Kobe had heard often enough to recognize. He remembered that call because afterward Lamont came out celebrating the deal and bought takeout from a restaurant they normally couldn't afford at the time. Kobe had texted a friend about it that same night, complaining jokingly about how expensive the food was. The text still existed in an old phone backup with the date attached. That detail mattered now in a way it hadn't then. He had also been in the car when Lamont said, referring to the supplier relationship with Raymond Osie's firm, "She made the introduction, but I'm the one who built it into something." Kobe remembered that because they had been driving back from Decatur after picking up a replacement battery for the company truck, and Lamont repeated the line twice during the drive as though convincing himself. Kobe had written part of it down later in the notes app he used at the time to track truck mileage and delivery pickups for the company. And he remembered the filing conversation most clearly of all. He had been sitting at the kitchen table the evening Lamont came home from a filing appointment and said, with the specific satisfaction of a man correcting something that annoyed him, that my name on the original paperwork had been a formality he had always intended to address. Kobe had said nothing that evening. He was 20 years old. He filed it the way he filed everything, carefully, completely, without announcing that he was doing so. He told Uncle Drayden that if attorneys asked him questions under oath, he would answer them truthfully without hesitation. Drayden said very little during the conversation. Kobe described him as a man suddenly doing arithmetic he had not expected to need. After leaving Drayden's house, Kobe went to the storage unit, removed the last boxes carrying his name, and drove them to my house. He stacked them in the second bedroom without ceremony and came to find me in the kitchen. "It's done," he said. I made him coffee and we sat for a while without needing to fill the silence. What I did not know until that evening was what Drayden had done immediately after Kobe left his house. He had called Lamont. The call lasted 6 minutes. I did not have the content of that call directly, but I had the consequence of it, which arrived in the form of Lamont appearing at my front door at 7:43 that evening, for the first time since the discovery process had formally opened. I did not let him in. I stood in the doorway and looked at him and waited. His face had the specific quality of a man who has just understood something he cannot unknow. The performance was completely gone. What was underneath it was not what I expected, not rage, not threat. It was the expression of a man who had just realized that his son had been watching him his entire adult life and had chosen, carefully and permanently, to keep the parts that mattered. He stood on that porch for 11 seconds. Then he left. Uncle Drayden called on a Thursday morning at 9:52. I saw his name on the screen and let it ring twice before I answered. Not from hesitation, from the specific intention of making sure he understood that his call was being received on my terms and no others. Davina. His voice had lost the expansiveness it carried at the dinner table. What replaced it was the careful tone of a man who had recently sat across from an attorney and come away with information that rearranged his priorities completely. "Drayden," I said. He began with a version of context setting that was designed to sound like concern, but was structured entirely around his own position. He had not understood the full nature of what Lamont had asked him to do. He had accepted the transfer in good faith. He wanted me to know that he had never intended to be part of anything that complicated my situation. I let him finish. Then I said, "I appreciate you calling. My attorney is aware of the transfer. Whatever you need to do to address your own exposure, I'd suggest you move quickly." Silence. "That's all I have for you, Drayden," I said, and I ended the call. He came to the house 2 days later without calling ahead. I saw his car from the front window, and I stood there for a moment deciding what receiving him would cost me versus what turning him away would communicate. I opened the door before he knocked. He was a large man who had always used his size as part of his presence, filling doorways, occupying rooms. Standing on my porch that afternoon, he looked diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical dimensions. He had a property deed creating legal liability he had not anticipated, and a nephew whose exposure was pulling the floor out from under everyone who had laughed at that table. I did not invite him inside. I stood in the doorway, the same doorway where Lamont had stood 11 seconds before turning away. And I looked at Drayden with the specific patience of a woman who has already determined the value of a conversation before it begins. He said he was sorry about the dinner. He said it the way people say things when the consequence of not saying them has become more uncomfortable than saying them. I received it without expression. "I need you to know I didn't understand what he was asking me to hold," he said. "I believe you," I said. "That's between you and your attorney." He looked at me for a long moment. I think he had arrived expecting something that would make him feel better about having laughed. What he found was a woman who had already closed the accounting on that evening and had nothing further to offer him from it. He left without the thing he came for. The 2 calls that followed that week were easier to manage because they were conducted at a distance. A cousin from Lamont's side who had laughed and was now hearing through family channels that the legal situation was more serious than Lamont had represented it to be. A woman who had been at the table and called with the specific energy of someone gathering information under the cover of checking in. I was cordial with both. I volunteered nothing. By the end of that week, the family who had filled that dinner table with laughter had gone very quiet. And the silence from their direction felt nothing like the silence from mine. Cecily called on a Monday with the kind of composure that carries good news without announcing it. The property transfer to Uncle Drayden had been flagged in discovery as fraudulent conveyance. The timing of the transfer, initiated within days of the discovery process opening, made the intent impossible to argue around. The court had noted it. Lamont's attorney had filed a response that Cecily described as thin. The court's adjustment to the asset valuation in light of the concealment moved entirely in my favor. "The bad faith finding changes the calculus significantly," Cecily said. "His attorney is creating distance from the asset hiding. When your own legal representation starts stepping back from your decisions, the position has collapsed." I thanked her and set the phone down. I did not celebrate. There was nothing in me that wanted to celebrate. What I felt was the particular settledness of watching something land exactly where the evidence always indicated it would land. What reached me next came through Kobe. He called 2 days later and told me what he had heard through a mutual contact. That Lamont had told Tressa about the business dispute directly. Not because he wanted to be honest with her, but because the financial picture was becoming impossible to conceal from someone who had been making plans around it. He had told her the valuation was under dispute. He had told her the payout would come from profits across several years. He had told her this, Kobe said, in what sounded like a moment of desperation rather than disclosure. Tressa stopped returning his calls the following day. I received that information and filed it without comment. Tressa had made her calculation the same way Lamont had made his, based on what she believed she was inheriting. When the inheritance changed shape, she responded accordingly. There was nothing surprising in that. There was nothing that required my energy. Lamont called me on a Wednesday evening at 8:10. I answered because Cecily had advised me to document all contact, and because something in the cadence of his calling, the hour, the fact that it came from his personal phone rather than through his attorney, told me this call was different from the last time he called. It was. His voice had none of the professional architecture it had carried before. No controlled tone, no structured argument. What came through the line was the sound of a man who had run out of positions to hold and was standing in the open with nothing left to manage himself with. He said, I knew from the beginning I couldn't have built it without you. I said nothing. I knew it when you made the call to Raymond. I knew it when you signed the guarantee. I knew it every time someone in that industry responded to the business because your name was attached to it. He paused. I just didn't think you'd ever make me say it out loud. The line was quiet for a long moment. I needed to hear you say it, I said. And now you have. I ended the call. I sat with the phone in my hand for a while after. Not because I was moved toward forgiveness or pulled back toward grief, but because there is a specific weight that arrives when the truth you have known privately is finally spoken by the person who spent years pretending otherwise. It changed nothing about what came next, but it closed something that had been open. The settlement meeting lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. I know the duration because I looked at my watch when I sat down, and again when Cecily set the final document in front of me. Not from impatience. From the habit of a woman who has spent her professional life understanding that time has value and that knowing exactly how much of it something costs is part of knowing what it was worth. Lamont was not in the room. His attorney represented his position across a table that was deliberately neutral, a conference room in a building that belonged to neither firm, chosen for exactly that reason. Cecily had arranged it. She arranged everything with the same precision she brought to every other aspect of the preceding months. The negotiations had stretched longer than either side originally expected. There had been disputes over valuation methods, over projected future revenue, over what portion of my contribution qualified as recoverable business equity versus marital investment. 2 mediation sessions had ended without resolution before this final meeting was scheduled. The terms were presented in sequence. The original capital contribution, $61,000 across the initial withdrawal and 3 subsequent transfers, returned in full with appreciation calculated conservatively. Across the years it had been operating inside the business without acknowledgement or repayment. The number on the document was not extravagant. It was simply documented growth attached to documented money. I looked at it and thought briefly of a rainy Tuesday morning outside a bank and said nothing. The founding contribution percentage, established through the paper trail, the supplier guarantee, Kobe's testimony, and the disputed amendment filing, translated into a formal settlement valuation of my role in the business's early formation. Lamont's attorney had contested the percentage repeatedly during negotiations and succeeded in reducing some portions Cecily initially pursued. Cecily accepted the adjustment strategically in exchange for stronger terms elsewhere. That was the thing about real settlements. Nobody walked out believing they had won every point. The house was mine. Not because a court dramatically handed it to me in a single ruling, but because the financial records showed clearly that most mortgage payments and renovation costs had been sustained through income tied directly to my consulting work and accounts. Lamont retained operational control of the business. But the business had also been valued accurately by an independent forensic accounting firm both sides ultimately agreed to use after disputing each other's initial assessors for weeks. What remained after taxes, debt obligations, operating costs, and realistic revenue projections was not the empire Lamont had been describing socially for years. It was a stable company with meaningful income and structured obligations. Part of those obligations now belonged to me. The settlement established quarterly payments across 4 years rather than one large immediate payout. Neither side believed the company could absorb cleanly without creating additional litigation. Every door I had opened was somewhere inside those documents. Raymond Osei's firm, the guarantee, the founding capital, all of it converted from memory into arithmetic and settled in a conference room on a Thursday afternoon. The forgery issue appeared in a separate section entirely, proceeding independently, outside the settlement terms, outside my control. Cecily had referred the matter for formal review, but she had made something very clear to me during the process. Civil resolution and criminal review were not the same thing. One did not guarantee the other. Cecily slid the final page across the table. "This is where you sign," she said. I read the full document before I picked up the pen. Every line. Not because I didn't trust Cecily's work, because I had learned in a bank, in a filing office, in 11 years of watching what happens when women stop reading what they sign, that the most expensive mistakes live in the paragraphs people skip. I signed my name, Davina A. Presswood. Clean, unhurried, every letter exactly where it belonged. Cecily collected the pages and squared them against the table. "It's done," she said. I set the pen down. It was. The kitchen was full of morning light when Kobe came downstairs. He had stayed the night, not because anything had happened that required it, but because that was the kind of presence he had settled into since the settlement closed. Steady, unannounced. The way light comes through a window you forgot you left uncovered, not dramatic, just there when you look up. He made coffee without asking whether I wanted any, and set a cup on the counter beside me the way people do when they have learned the rhythms of a space and have decided they belong inside them. I wrapped both hands around it and watched him move through my kitchen with the ease of someone who had chosen to be there and was not performing the choice. Inez arrived at 11 with food she had not called ahead about. I heard her car in the driveway and opened the door before she knocked, the way she had opened her door for me on that Sunday afternoon that felt both recent and very far away. She came in and set things on the counter and looked around the kitchen, the way you look at a room that has been through something and come out the other side of it still standing. "Good light in here," she said. "Always has been," I said. We ate at the round table Kobe pulled close to the window. The three of us. No occasion, no agenda. Just the particular ease of people who have earned their place at the same table and have nothing left to prove to each other or to anyone beyond that room. After Inez left and Kobe had gone to the back of the house, I stood at the kitchen counter in the afternoon quiet, and I let myself simply be inside it. This was the kitchen I had stood in the night after the dinner, moving through rooms, touching nothing, taking inventory of everything my hands had built and chosen and arranged before Lamont Gadsden ever walked through the front door. I had stood in this exact spot and opened a drawer and found a folder I had kept without fully admitting to myself why I was keeping it. I looked at that drawer now, closed, empty, Everything that had been inside it had served its purpose and passed through the hands that needed to hold it and was no longer required. What surrounded me now was what had always surrounded me. The counter I chose because of the morning light. The shelving I assembled alone on a Sunday. The framed print above the fireplace I purchased with my own money before I had ever spoken his name. All of it mine, before he arrived. All of it mine now that he was gone. Not recovered, not reclaimed. Simply always mine, waiting with the patience of things that belong somewhere for the temporary arrangement to finish. I pulled a notepad from the kitchen drawer, the one I kept for grocery lists and phone numbers and the ordinary maintenance of a life that was entirely my own. I uncapped a pen, and I wrote at the top of a clean page, not a signature, not a legal document, not a settlement term or a founding contribution or a correction of public record. Just a name, Davina Presswood. I looked at it for a long moment, the letters sitting exactly where I had put them, belonging to no filing, no amendment, no man who had decided they were a formality he intended to address. Just mine. My name was always Presswood. I just forgot for a while who she was.